Good morning. My name is Margarita Vargas Betancourt. I am co-chair of the International Archival Affairs Section of the Society of American Archivists, better known as IAAS, and on behalf of the steering committee, it is a pleasure to invite you to the Archival Landscapes IAAS seminar series. Archival Landscapes is a virtual seminar series of the International Archival Affairs Section of the Society of American Archivists. In each seminar, an international guest speaker introduces participants to the issues and advancements in their local context, describing the history, operating environment, and unique aspects of archival practice in their country. The seminar series is hosted by the Graduate School of Library and Information Studies, Queens College, City University of New York. On behalf of the IAAS Steering Committee, I would like to thank them for hosting this series. Today's seminar will feature Romania. Our guest speaker is Dr. Bogdan-Florin Popovici, who works at the National Archives of Romania. Dr. Bogdan-Florin Popovici graduated the Faculty of Archival Sciences in Bucharest, Romania in 1999. He holds a Ph.D. in history. He attended several training programs in Europe, France, and Italy. He works with the National Archives of Romania, Brasov County Division since 2009, as archivist and recently as head of division. He has been actively involved with ICA Committee on Best Practices and Standards, respectively Experts Group for Archival Description. He participated at several international professional meetings, including Slovenia, Italy, Oman, Russia, Hungary, Mexico, South Korea, Spain, both as a speaker and as a professional trainer. He's also involved in translating professional standards into Romanian. Before we listen to Dr. Popovici's presentation, I would like to request that you write any question that you have for him or for the IAAS in the chat box. At the end of his presentation, we will have a Q&A session. Thank you. So, Dr. Popovici, your turn. Can you unmute yourself? Thank you.
Good morning, I think, in the United States. Good evening from Romania. I'm very grateful for being invited to hold a presentation within this series of topics. And thank you for participating. I'm going to give you some broad ideas, broad histories about Romanian archives and Romanian archival science. And I hope you'll find interesting, and I'll be very glad at the end of my presentation to answer to your questions. If it is a motto that I might have to the presentation, it would be this saying from a former Romanian politician after he was active during the First World War, that this country is so lucky that it needs no politicians. It is also true for the institution of National Archives. In many situations, it is so lucky to survive different problems, different issues across a long time, that it doesn't need any real management, a real concentration on very high goals, because sometimes the fate take care of us. That would be my agenda today, and I shall try in the next 15-20 minutes to make my presentation. First of all, who is Romania? Just to contextualize the country. Well, very briefly, it will be the land of Dracula, the land that was made famous by the former communist dictator Nicolae Ceausescu. But on the other hand, the country of some very well-known sport players like Nadia Comaneci, the famous gymnast, or Gheorghe Hagi. In more academic dimensions, let's say it is a country from Eastern Europe. It is not a big, not a small country. You know, Europe has a different dimensions than North America. It is just for the order of magnitude is 41 times smaller than the United States. It's a former communist country. We used to be a satellite of the Soviet Union, and this had an impact also on archival practice and archival science in Romania, as we shall see. Now, my country is a member of European Union with a democratic political regime and free market economy. Historically, we had two different parts. In fact, there are three principalities, but two main parts. One, the violet, colored in violet on this map, which is the region outside of the Carpathian Mountains, which was ruled by, let's say, native population with an Orthodox church denomination, things that had impact over archival practices across time. And the red area, which was part of Hungarian Kingdom or Austrian Empire until the end of the World War I. This is important, as we shall see immediately, because all these historical facts would have shaped the history of archival practice and archival ideas. Today, the country is organized in 42 counties, which is very, even if they are separated, it is the model of the governance of the country is a rather centralized one. And again, this has impacts over archival organization. Some quick history about archival thinking in Romania and archival practices. As I mentioned, we had two broad territories, a split between Catholic and Orthodox areas. The Orthodox areas that were the Moldavia and Wallachia principalities, how they were named, had a slower development of administration. First records date back on 14th century. And initially, they have Slavonic language as administration. So the records are written in Slavonic. And today, in order to manage them and to read them, you need to know, as an archivist, you need to know paleography. On the other hand, in Transylvania, which was a Catholic area, it was part of the Kingdom of Hungary. It was recorded an earlier development of administration, 11th, 12th, 13th century. Latin was the language of administration as it was in Western Europe in most of the countries. Also, there are many local autonomies which developed their own repositories of records. And this is why the archivists in the Transylvania today have older and more sophisticated records and sophisticated records collections than in the eastern part of the country. In modern times, Transylvania became part of the Austrian Empire, and that brought to this territory and to the administration in this territory new rules of German origin. We have, for instance, the registration system introduced in 1772, which was quite revolutionary for that time. We have different languages for administration, and this generates as a must for an archivist in this area to know several foreign languages, several paleographies in order to read those records, and also recorded a larger body of documents, of holdings, of records that were collected in those local autonomies in time. That means the county divisions of national archives in these areas are richer and older than in other parts of the country. In the same development with archival development, considering the German rules, at the end of 19th century, we faced the implementation of what we may call today records management rules, with very sophisticated classification schemes, files, system of retrieval and indexing, and so on. And even in the first decade of the 20th century, we had the first attempts of appraisal and disposition for the records held by local authorities. In the eastern part of the country, the registration system was also used starting from 1832, based on the French or German origin. It is not yet very well known the origin of this system in Romania. But as a curiosity, as a peculiar fact, in 1932, the State Archives was established as an institution. Basically, we were rather contemporary with the Public Records Office in UK. And this happened because in these years, in 1831, 1832, a new system, a new administrative system was introduced, and suddenly older institutions with their older records became obsolete. So they considered they need to found a new institution where the records should be transferred to, not destroyed, but just transferred for preservation. And here is why the State Archives appeared in that moment. Another interesting fact: in 1827, it was decided that the records belong to the institution and not to the employees. Until that date, a nobleman who acted as an employee, state employee, civil servant, let's say, could take the records he compiled a job at home, considering it was his or her records, basically. But after this year, it was officially asserted that the records should be organizational record and not private records. It is interesting because even today, some of the ministries consider that the paper they sign should be in their custody after that. In 1920, Romania is recognized as a state within new boundaries. So all those previous principalities were unified, as it happened with many countries in Central and Eastern Europe after the First World War. And only 4 years afterwards, a new Archives Act was issued. The core idea was that the archives were preserved for writing history. So it was considered, archival science was considered since then as an appendix, an auxiliary science of history. And one of the greatest problems in implementation of this Archives Act was that it did not contain any provisions about records creators that led many ministries and many institutions in that time to destroy their records and nothing led nothing to be transferred to national archives, to state archives, as it was called in that time, as historical records. And this was an open wound for the archivist and for the institution, which was to be repaired only afterwards during the communist time. I should also mention the fact that in 1924, it was established a high school for archival science and paleography. It was a post-university school aimed to train the archivists who were supposed to activate within the state archives. And also that in 1938, based on Italian tradition, it was initiated a methodological reform, which basically set the framework for archive science in Romania even until today. First of all, archives was considered the whole of records produced from the moment of their creation until their permanent preservation in the state archives. Somehow it is a records continuum. So basically we do not mean by archives only historical archives, but also what is called the records in English. The framework for administration, the archives, is the so-called 3H, that is current records, current archives, intermediate archives, and historical archives. It was theoretized the archival processing and the archival operations, the archival activities, like arrangement, description, and so on. And it was introduced and set as a rule to consider to aggregate the records in fonts, in archival fonts. After the Second World War, the communist was imposed in our country and brought also to the archives and to archival administration the general principles, if I may call them like this, of the regime. First of all, it was centralization. That means the management of records and the organization, the administration of the whole process of records creation and preservation was centralized. That is, state archives was the authority to dictate how to make the record keeping in the country. A second threat would be the totalitarian thinking, that is, there is only one valid course of action, there is no alternative to it. A third would be scientificity. I don't know if this is really English, but it was an obsession of the communism, and it was also transferred to the archival science in Romania. That is, any decision is in the name of science, so it must be respected as a scientific fact, as an exact fact of science, which is rather disputable because, well, nor history is really a very exact science, not to mention archival science. Another threat, which is rather, another feature which is rather characteristic for Romania, was the nationalization. That means the private papers were confiscated by the state. And this is happening especially after 1970. I shall come back to this to explain the context. Another feature would be the ideologization of appraisal and archival practice. For instance, the first rules for appraisal said that one of the most important criteria for retaining records for permanent preservation is that the record should reflect the fight, the struggle of the working class in order to get the power. Okay, and this would be the bad sides of the job, but the good side is that all these characteristics allow for an institution who intends to introduce good measures, gives to that institution a great administrative power for standardization and preservation. This is why during the communism, as we shall see immediately, we had standards for archival processing and record-keeping processing in general, and also there are possibilities to organize a network of repositories and erect buildings and take preservation measures for keeping records in proper conditions. In 1951, the state archives were transferred from the Ministry of Culture under the authority of the Ministry of Interior, along with the police and state security, if you can imagine that. And this gave the state archives, on the one hand, some sort of authority, on the other hand, a shade of being the, let's say, the power of state, the repressive power of state. In 1953, the concept of National Archives Fund was developed based on the Soviet model. You may meet this concept in all former communist countries, even in Europe or in other places like in China, for instance. And basically this model was taken into consideration because it seemed at that moment to solve an older wish of archivists to set control over records production and to protect them. So basically all the records created in the country belong to the state and can be preserved and can be regulated by the state archives. In 1957, we had the first standards for records management that regulated the registration, classification scheme, retention schedules, and the procedures for approving the destruction of records. In the beginning of the 70s, we had the standard for archival processing, that is processing within the National Archives. Buildings are repository, already mentioned. And here is what I presented before, 1971-74. It was made an attempt to rationalize the historical sources. That is, among the different institutions and even private holders of records or books or whatever, it was decided by the state that all of them should be entrusted to the specialized body of the state. That is, records, no matter who is the holder, should be transferred to the state archives. Books, no matter who is the holder, historical books, I mean, should be transferred to the libraries. And if there are pieces of historical value, should be transferred to the museums, even if they belong to private persons. In the same period of time, archives was considered very sensitive and very important for the political of the state, because it was decided that historical records that may endanger the official version of history should be classified, should be made secret. And this is why new secret funds were born in the state archives. That this system lasted until the fall of the communism. Another interesting interesting experience occurred after 1984, when the state asked the state archives and the archivists to monetarily appraise the archival goods. And basically the archivist took every document, especially the older one, the medieval ones, until the modern period, and start set value for them, monetary value, how much it costs. A new law, which is still active, dates back from 1996. Which are archival institutions in Romania, archival in the general meaning as we use it in Romania. As a public institution, National Archives is the most important holder of historical records. Also, as it happened in all former communist countries, there is a National Council for the Study of Archives of the Former State Security. This is a body that was, according to the law, enabled to collect all records that used to be created, that were created by the repressive forces of the state. This is a very delicate aspect, because on the one hand, it is understandable the interest of the people and the interest of researcher for this topic, but it also reflects the fact the state archives or national archives was not trustable enough in order to receive the recent records, and they need a new body to preserve them. And the third aspect that may be arguably around the foundation of this institution is the fact that basically they took only a share of records. They broke the fonts, they broke the archives of the institutions and transferred them only those records which were pertaining to a certain topic, which from archival point of view, it may be disputable how much it affected the meaning of records, the context of preservation of the record, and so on. Also, Romanian Academy, National Library, and museums may have records, but all of them in rather collection than in organic fonts and organic gatherings, and anyway in smaller amounts than the National Archives. As a private holders of records, first of all, we may quote the churches, especially in Transylvania. Churches were associated with certain ethnic groups, and they have a large collection of records. Also, there are some small private collectors, and in the recent years, there are private record centers, and some of them have also records of historical value. The last section of my presentation will cover the record-keeping framework today. According to the law, National Archives is the authority that had to regulate the field of record-keeping in Romania. In fact, it is a wishful thinking, because it is very hard to deal even with the public administration, nor to mention the private bodies. And this is why in many aspects, we admit there is a big problem, but until now there is no legal solution to this. The change of the law would have tried to set the private bodies and a private practice of records management on their own course without the surveillance of national archives. But until now, that law was not passed by the parliament, so we still keep this provision, which is really inapplicable. As a theoretical framework, is the same as I outlined it before. It was outlined at the beginning of the 1940s. Archives is the whole of records produced by one creator. The nature of record does not depend of carrier. So from this point of view, the provisions applicable to records, to paper records, to analogic records are the same that should be applied from the management point of view to the electronic records too. And also for the management purposes, we acknowledge the three age of archive, that is the current archives, intermediate archives, and permanent archives, which is supposed to start after 30 years from the creation of records. As general provisions for records management, each organization should be a records manager. That is a provision of the law, but in practice, this does not work, because as it was a sad joke in Romania, the records manager is the first member of the staff who is fired in case of staff reduction. The law consecrates the registration of records, and this very moment is vaguely theoretical presented in the regulation. So in practice, there are many challenges, because many organizations, mostly those one who have a large number of records, started to register at the file level and not at the record level. And also with the implementation of electronic system for management of records, a new rules started to appear somehow parallel with the legal provisions. Also, the legislation set as mandatory for each organization to have a classification scheme. It was based on the structure, it's not based on functions until now. And these classification schemes must be formally approved by the National Archives or its territorial branches. As a records control, the law requests lists that yearly it should be made by the creator, lists of the folder level describing each folder that is created within one division, and each list contain the records, the folders that have the same retention schedule. This is very useful from the point of view of disposition, but it's a nightmare from the point of view of retrieval. As appraisal of disposition, we have one tool, integrated classification scheme plus retention periods. And this tool is approved formally, as I said, by the National Archives, and the disposition itself, the process of disposition, should be also approved by the National Archives case by case. Transfer, in theory, after 30 years from creation, permanent records are transferred to the National Archives. Sometimes earlier, if an institution sees its existence, sometimes later, if there is no free space available, free room in the National Archives repository. As a practice in the inside the National Archives, the institution is a centralized one. That means there is a headquarters in the capital, in Bucharest, and there are territorial branches in each county, the one that I presented at the beginning. This may offer a certain uniformity in action, but it is a great problem from the point of view of budgetary resources, because each territorial, each local branches has different needs, and the budget is generally set on general lines, so the big trouble in this regard. Concerning the staff of the National Archives is not formed by archivists. Officially, all the personnel is considered to be civil servant. And beside being, let's say, not professionally very honorable, it gives a rigidity in mobility of staff. For instance, we cannot afford to have, as I read that it happens in the United States, to hire temporarily staff for processing a bunch of records, because this is not the way civil servant works. So basically, the people are rather fixed on their positions in the institution, and this is not really very useful for those who are let's say, not very hardworking. It's not very useful for the institution. Admission in the institution is not conditioned because of this civil servant and civil servant legislation, is not conditioned by any professional background. Basically, you can take any person, pass an exam, which is a legal exam, basically on legislation, and is admission. If the professional background is from archival science, that is good. If not, basically the staff will be trained sur le tas, as the French say, so in the working place. If you add to this the lack of a professional training center, you may have an image that it is a great problem from the point of view of quality of the knowledge of personnel. As if this would not be enough, the National Archive is severely understaffed, mainly in the recent years. Because of budgetary consideration, the number of staff were reduced step by step. And this makes that mainly in territorial division to be a sort, the staff to be a sort of jack of all trades. There is no specialization, so everybody is doing a lot of things, a lot of tasks, from records management supervision to archives management. On the other hand, this is a good thing because basically when you talk with this kind of employee, he is able to navigate very familiar in all aspects of archival practice and archival science. But on the other hand, of course, the deep of the knowledge is not so high. Due to social context, a great emphasis in Romania is, and in the National Archives, is put on administrative tasks. And this is why it is a struggle between historical and mundane activities, between being a mere archivist and being a historian. Many archivists consider themselves historians and aim to produce academic papers. Others are focusing on the records management area and on processing the records, considering themselves as archivists. And it's always a fight between the two perspectives. From the processing point of view, the current legal framework and the current perspectives generate the conditions for huge backlogs in taking care of records. The National Archives does not have enough space to take to accession the records that should be taken in as permanent in our repositories. Some figures even suggest that the amount of records we hold is smaller than the amount of records that we should accession in our repository. That would mean doubling the repository capacity. That will not happen, and this is why I always make a reference to David Bierman, that used to say that we need to change the paradigm because we cannot afford cities of archival repositories only because the archivists have a certain perspective over appraisal and over defining the permanent records. A very strong characteristic, which is common also as far as I noticed to other colleagues in former communist country, is a great emphasis on information, on content of the records, more than on the context of the records. That means we care what it is in the files. We don't care who created the files, in what context the file was created, in what context the file reached the archives. In this regard, there is no surprise that there is no formal reference to any archival principles in our procedures and in the official regulations. Some of the reference to these principles and the explanation, the explanation of what of their meaning and implications are only presented in academic papers. Records are often kept grouped on accessions, and many accession forms the font, though this has no theoretical foundation and no other reason than the commodity in processing records. Arrangement is often based on diplomatic form, that means files and folders and registers, and on chronological criteria, and ignores the functional or the organizational criteria, organization structure of the creator. The finding aid, as we call it, inventory, is a list of every folder in a font. We do not have finding aids at serious level. This is not, this has a bad side, which is it creates a huge backlogs in processings. On the other hand, it's very useful when these finding aids are set online, because basically if researchers are searching for a certain topic, they can land exactly on the folder that refers to a certain topic, file that refers to a certain topic. Not seldom, archivists rearrange the holdings, imposing their own order for making the record easier to be used. This is another aspect supporting the initial assertion that it is an emphasis on information. They say we don't care the context of creating information, we only care to retrieve the information itself. So we can, if I can group together the files that are pertaining to a certain topic, that is perfect. We don't really care about their source of creation and so on. Though this is a practice, it is not recommended by the procedures, but it is tolerated because of the lack of staff. So the idea in many cases is to privilege the finishing the processing of certain holdings and not really respecting the theoretical principles. Since 2013, an attempt was made to use the ICA standards due to introduction basically of a professional archival management system. This is why in our portal you can see, but not this is why, because of the reasons I presented in the previous slide, if you look at our portal, you may see many folder level descriptions, very few font level description, and almost no series or sub-font level descriptions, because in practice we do not have this finding aids and this description made. From the point of view of use of records, as it happened in most of the former communist country, after the fall of the totalitarian regime, the National Archives became a sort of center for obtaining sources of evidence in order to obtain restitutions of land and or different other rights that were affected during the communist regime, and compensations. Which from one point of view, it is proof that the National Archives and the archives in general are a very important pillar of the society. But from the practical point of view, this spike of requests was not accompanied by a change of staff. So basically there is no enough personnel to process all this restitution and compensation. And even today, there are huge delays in answering to the citizens' requests. For academic use, many times there is a conflict of legislation and various pieces of legislation on restrictions. There are some restrictions set in the archival law, which are general records, classified records, personal records, and so on. But on the other hand, some new legislation came, and for the active records, let's call them like this, there are different restrictions, and sometimes there is a collision between what is public in outside, when the records are outside of the National Archives, and different restriction periods when the records are within the National Archives administration. In the latest years, we try to be present online, but the greatest surprise was that between the dreams of archivists and the dream of some users and the reality that is the capacity of users to use professional tools in order to retrieve retrieve information about records, it is a gap, and it is very hard to manage to put a bridge over these things, because permanent improvement to the system would require budget, and this budget is an issue. As conclusions, I think we have an interesting history, full of interesting things to learn, but also we have a challenging present. From a conceptual point of view, we have a solid intellectual background aligned with many archival trends, but unfortunately this is opposed to the practical, short-sighted, and as I call them, household approach that sometimes seen as more efficient. These practices, are an implicit defy of the classical Western archival precepts. Unfortunately, there is no theoretization of these practicalities that we have in Romania and to check their validity, except some local initiative. This is better this way, and not respecting principles or whatever. And unfortunately, all this is accompanied by a lack of appetite for innovation. As an institution, National Archives exists, and I think this is a good thing, because it is an institution that really protects the records as a core mission. It's the only institution that has this as a core mission within the state institutional framework. But unfortunately, it is understaffed and under-budgeted. On the other hand, due to social context that I mentioned, we may say that the institution has a not very clear identity. It is a cultural institution or it is an administrative institution. And this is why it is a rather low institutional profile within the public institutions. I mean, the administrative institution is looking towards us as their partner for administrative stuff, but we are not 100% administrative, and we claim our cultural share. On the other hand, the cultural institutions are looking towards us as partners in cultural things, but we do not have only cultural vocation, so we had some restriction in this area, and they don't understand always this status of ours. And that would be rather all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Popovici. This has been very interesting, especially for those who, like me, live in another continent and come from other countries. This has been like very, very interesting. We have so many things in common and so many things that are different. So we have some questions coming in, and as I read them to Dr. Popovici, please feel free to write more questions in the chat. James is going to let me know if you write any other questions, so we will try to answer all of them. So the first question that we have for you, Dr. Popovici, is how did the churches perceive the 1924 Archives Act? How did it affect their function as repositories across Romania? Were the churches in favor or against it?
Yeah, the question is very good. You know, it's again, for contextualization, though my fellows not always accept contextualization, I always need to do it. You should have in mind that when the greatest Romania, as we call it, after the First World War was established, it was a national state. So the idea was that this is the state of Romanians. The most important church repositories, the more important church archives, were belonging to the new minorities, let's call the Hungarian, the German ones. And this is why the law in that moment was, let's say, not really very offensive against the churches, and did not affect very much the church archives. First, because they were very new, the population were new in the state. On the other hand, the other pieces of legislation that affected the minorities in Romania may affected the way churches preserve their records. But in 1924, there was no explicit requests or no explicit provision about how the churches should keep their records. When they were very much affected was in 1941, 1971, 1974, when the legislation specifically targeted those records of historical values, and these church archives held many historical records, so then they were very severely affected, but not before that. In 1924, it was rather a fair regime to them. archivally speaking. If this answers to your question.
Thank you very much. So we have the next question. And could you tell us more about the Soviet idea of a national fund?
Yeah, well, this is an interesting topic. I was writing about it, and it's very actual, because many countries, if you look at the former communist countries in Europe, except for Hungary, you may see that they keep this concept again, though it is, let's say, not archival, because it is not, and this terminology, National Archival Fund, let in error also great archivists like Terry Cook or Michel Duchamp, that considered it is the fund of the state, the archival fund of the state. Well, it is nothing like that. It is called National Archival Fund, but in fact, probably a better translation would be the National Archival Heritage. And if you want to compare it to the probably more familiar concept, that would be a sort of total archive, as it happened in Canada. That is, what is valuable, what is permanent from the archival point of view, is considered as belonging to National Archival Fund. But I personally argued against this concept, because when we talk about fund, we talk about a creator. So it's the body of records belonging to one creator. And since the National Archive Fund is an accumulation of records from different creators, this cannot be an archival fund in itself. It's a clash of concepts. But and this is specifically for those practices where the idea of contextualized records is not very well established, not firmly established. It is rather, we bring documents together, bring records together. It is important information inside them. It is not important where they came from. But I think this, well, one more idea, this appeared in Soviet Union because the records were menaced in 1921 when they introduced this topic into archival theory. But this is not the fact for the countries after the Second World War. So it was not really a menace, but it was just an idea to copy the concept from the Soviets. Why the people does not give up to the concept right now, this is something to be studied, because it is very interesting how the mentality of the archivist is keep on preserving a concept which is really colliding, let's say, with the classical archival theory.
Thank you, that was very interesting. And the next question is, were many records destroyed as an alternative to being made secret or classified? Who would have access to these secret records?
No, the records were not destroyed. We didn't record it. We didn't record the case as it happened in East Germany, where they shred the records before the fall of the communism. We do not have examples of this sort, but they were hardly, very, very hard declassified after the fall of the communism. But slowly, when the political will existed, those records were transferred from the secret services, from the various, as we call them, repressive institutions, to this institute of studying. So basically, they are declassified and they are freely available to researchers today. But there are no recordings of, let's say, purposely and in big amount of records to be destroyed. We do not have this experience.
And who has access to these records?
Well, if they are declassified, any researchers may have access. But if they are still classified, they are not accessible. Some of these records are considered, which are still in the custody of the Secret Service, are considered as being, let's say, important from the national security, and they are still kept there. But the greatest problem here is not that somebody wanted, or the greatest challenge for the National Archives too, is not that somebody wanted to keep those records hidden. The greatest problem is how to process them legally. Because according to the law for classified records, those classified records should be processed piece by piece, item by item. Or you can imagine that in archives, we do not process records item by item. We process them on aggregations, on folders, on file level. Well, imagine that in a file, somebody in 1950s just put a stamp, secret, or top secret. In this very moment, that record is governed by the law for classified records. So you need to have a very complicated and long procedure in order to declassify that specific item. If it's not declassified, it cannot be lent to the reading room for researchers. So you cannot have a full list of all those records that have classification marks on it. So it's very hard to process them, and if a folder have enough records with that classification marks, you may stop from the research the whole folder. And this is a problem because as you probably know, the classification of records is made on various levels, and not all the staff in the archives have access to all those levels. So for instance, you may have an archivist who have access to confidential level and find you are reprocessing a record which is a file which has as a level of classification secret. In that moment, the archivist himself or herself should stop processing that records and ask the archivist with the proper classification credentials to process them. It's the same process everywhere because the law was made under the NATO standards, but dealing with these past records is really a problem in this very moment.
That's very interesting. I have so many more questions, but I will go to the last question that we have in the chat. Oh, I actually think we have some more. This is about, does Romania have plans for digitizing materials? Does it deliver digital content at all, or is it all access available only in person and on site?
Sure, we have projects, and we already have many things online, but the problem is with funding. I mean, you need the proper infrastructure, and due to several factors, I don't want to insist, we are not really allowed to use let's say public clouding and so on and so forth. So we need to have our own infrastructure in order to put the records online. And we in the last 10 years we made great progress in this regard. And as a strategy, maybe this would be more interesting. Even now we are having a project and trying to put all the finding aids that exists in the National Archives online. We based this approach on the fact that if you are digitizing anything, even a sheet of paper in a folder, you can put it online if you have the archival metadata, the description of the records there. So we decided to start with the finding aids to finish displaying on the internet all the finding aids in a structured matter in database and so on. And then any project of digitization would be much easier to be done because it will be basically the attachment of some images to the archival description.
There are many questions here, but we will end at 11. We appreciate very much your time. I'll just ask one more. And the question is, did archives suffer significantly during wartime and other periods of unrest?
There have been some destroyings during the World War. Some bombardments destroyed a train full of records, but not very much. And as the periods of unrest, no. In general, it was, I mean, probably you know, we had a very severe fall of the communism. We call it the revolution in December '89 with street fight and so on. But no, in that time, the records were rather well protected, and we didn't record any problem, any troubles, any destruction of this sort.
Thank you. And we just received one last question. I think you've addressed it, but maybe if you can clarify more. what description standards do you use?
Currently, we are doing the description online based on ISFG and ISRCPF. And but the finding aids and procedures are still using the standard that were developed internally in 50s and 60s. But there is a sort of compatibility. It's not a big tragedy and not a big incompatibility between them. But what you see online is structured accordingly to ISFG.
Thank you very much, Dr. Popovici, and thank you very much for opening the series. It is very important, I think, for the world to connect, especially right now, and for the US to know what our colleagues are doing abroad, and this means a lot to IAAS and to me and my cohort and my colleagues here.
Thank you for your invitation, yeah.
And for the rest of you, we will upload this recording to the SAA's YouTube channel, and we can share the link with you. And in January, we will have our next seminar, and that one will be with Chile. And well, thank you everybody for making time to be here. Thank you again, Dr. Popovici. Thank you, James. Thank you to the Queen's College for hosting this seminar, and we will see you in January.
Thank you. Bye.